When I was 13, about 8 years ago now, I had an experience that still messes with my head. It happened on Halloween night in 2012. I remember it clearly because it was supposed to be a typical night of trick-or-treating with my friends, Max, Theo, and Lou. We decided to meet at my place since it was just a block away from the really fancy neighborhood, where all the big houses were known to hand out the best candy. Our plan was simple: start at my street, work our way through the good spots, and finish off with a loop around the quieter side of town. Before we headed out, though, Lou mentioned he had brought along some joints he'd gotten from his cousin. So, like the idiots we were, we smoked a little in the alley behind my house before kicking off the night. The first hour or so went great. We hit up my street, scored a decent stash, and then crossed into the fancy part of town. But by the time we were making our way back, aiming to cover the houses we'd missed, most people had already shut off their lights and called it a night. We figured our haul was good enough, but as we were about to turn back, we saw one house still lit up, one that was attached to a row of identical townhouses. Even though it felt a bit off, we were still greedy for more candy. We trooped up the steps and rang the doorbell. It took about a minute, but eventually we heard the heavy footsteps of someone moving around inside. When the door opened, this guy stood there, maybe in his mid-40s, wearing an old stained t-shirt and some worn-out boxers. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was messy, and there was a faint smell of sweat and booze coming from him. But he was smiling and friendly enough. He cracked a joke about how we must be the only ones left still trick-or-treating, and that meant we deserved a special reward. Then he told us to hang tight while he went inside to grab some treats. We didn't think anything of it. Maybe it was the weed still messing with our heads, but we were just standing there, chatting about how we hoped he'd have some full-size candy bars or something. I know now that we should have been more on guard, but in that moment, all we cared about was the candy we were going to get. It felt like he was gone forever. But when he came back, things took a turn I still wish I could forget. We stood there for what felt like forever, listening to his heavy steps thudding around the house. When he finally came back, he was holding a stack of slim black DVD cases, grinning like he was showing off some treasure. He fanned them out like a deck of playing cards and told us to take whichever ones we wanted. As he did, his smile stretched unnaturally wide, showing off teeth that were almost orange. I remember thinking I'd never seen teeth look that rotten in real life before. We glanced at the covers and our faces dropped. These weren't regular movies. They were adult films, and some didn't even have women on them. Max muttered something about us just wanting candy, hoping the guy would get the hint. But his grin only grew, his jagged teeth catching the porch light. "Nah, I get it," he said. "Boys your age have other interests. It's cool. You can trust me. Come on, don't be shy." We started backing away slowly, trying to keep our cool. I forced a polite smile, but the whole thing felt wrong. Just as I was about to tell the guy we should get going, he put his hand down his boxers and began touching himself, still talking to us like everything was normal. He kept saying he had more treats inside, and that we could come in, eat all the candy we wanted, and watch some cool movies with him. Every word made my skin crawl. Without another word, we bolted off that porch. Our bags and plastic pumpkins stuffed with candy banged against our sides as we sprinted out of there. My legs were burning, but I didn't dare look back until we were at least halfway down the street. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, I saw him standing at the edge of his driveway, watching us. He took a few slow steps after us, but then stopped, shaking his head and stumbling back inside. We kept running, cutting through the neighborhood until we reached the main road that led downhill toward my place. We didn't slow down until we were back at my house, practically falling over each other as we scrambled down the steps leading to the basement door at the back of my house. We burst inside, panting and laughing nervously, still high on adrenaline. For a long while, none of us said anything. We just stared at each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Theo finally broke the silence, asking if maybe the weed had made the whole thing seem weirder than it really was. But deep down, we all knew that guy was just off. We talked about how creepy it was, and as the minutes passed, we started to joke about it, making it seem less real. But we were still angry. Angry that someone like him could think he could do that to us. So, the next day, when the high had worn off and daylight made us feel braver, we decided to get a little revenge. We pooled together our leftover eggs from the fridge, marched back to his place during the afternoon, and unloaded on his house. Splat after splat, we painted his porch and windows with yolk and shells. We didn't stay to see if he was home or not. We just threw, laughed, and ran off. After that, we never set foot on that block again during Halloween. And even now, when someone mentions trick-or-treating, all I can think of is that guy's disgusting smile and how quickly a fun night with friends turned into something that still makes me shiver. Back when I was in my second year of college, my roommates and I threw a small Halloween party at our rented house. It was a cozy little place, just enough space for 4 of us. We'd host a few get-togethers throughout the year, mostly for our group of friends. We never went wild with invitations, just kept it within our circle, or, at most, friends of friends. It was easier to manage that way. That year, Halloween fell on a Friday night. It was around 8 p.m., and the neighborhood was quiet. Most houses were rented out to other students, so there weren't many trick-or-treaters, just a couple of families. The neighbors had 2 little kids, and another group lived in a small complex across the road. That was it. Since we were running low on drinks, I decided to head to a store nearby to restock. On the walk back, I noticed someone a few blocks away from our house. He wore what looked like a dirty, torn patient gown, with his face entirely hidden behind a piece of white cloth. There were large black circles drawn where the eyes should have been. He carried an old pillowcase that seemed full. I assumed he was trick-or-treating, but the guy looked to be at least in his mid-30s. His presence gave me the creeps, but hey, it's Halloween. People dress up to be weird, right? When I got back, a few of our friends had already arrived. There were probably 10 or so people hanging out. Everyone was in costume, some simple, some elaborate. I'd thrown on a suit, pretending to be some retro character, trying to look cooler than I actually was. We had everything from lazy ghost costumes made of sheets to more detailed outfits. The music was on, drinks were poured, and it felt like the night was off to a good start. As more people arrived, the vibe got livelier. By 10 p.m., there were about 20 folks packed into the small living room and kitchen. I recognized most faces, even if some were covered by masks. Though I'd had a few drinks, I made sure to stay clear-headed. One of my roommates did the same, just to make sure we didn't have any drama to deal with. Everything was in good spirits, no fights, no one too drunk to handle themselves. Around 11 p.m., we probably had close to 30 people crammed inside. A little more than we'd planned, but nothing we couldn't manage. I was chatting with a friend in the kitchen when I glanced into the living room. Someone passed by the doorway. It took a second for my brain to register it, but I was pretty sure it was the guy I'd seen earlier, the one dressed like some deranged mental patient. He moved too fast for me to get a good look and was gone almost instantly. I wasn't sure if it was really him or if I was just imagining things. But curiosity got the better of me, so I excused myself and headed in the direction he disappeared. The layout of our place had a narrow hallway that split off into the upstairs and the basement. Turning the corner, I realized he had to be on one of those 2 floors, but there was no trace of him. The basement was more or less a dump. We barely used it aside from storing old boxes and doing laundry. Figuring there was nothing down there worth stealing, I decided to head upstairs first. As I climbed the steps, I heard someone rustling around in my bedroom. I leaned around the doorway just enough to catch sight of that same guy, the one dressed in the asylum outfit. It hit me like a brick. We were being robbed. My first instinct was to rush in and tackle the guy, but I knew better. Instead, I stepped back and called the cops. I described him as best as I could. His weird DIY costume made him pretty recognizable. After that, I grabbed one of my roommates to help keep an eye on him. We positioned ourselves at the bottom of the stairs, ready to block him if he tried to bolt. But when I glanced up, I froze. There he was, standing at the top of the stairs, staring down at us. He had a bag in one hand, probably full of our stuff. "Listen, man," I called up, keeping my voice steady. "The police are on their way. Just drop the bag and leave, okay?" For a second, I thought he might do it. But then he started coming down, fast. Halfway down, he pulled a knife out from somewhere. The sight of it sent a jolt through me. Knife in one hand, bag in the other. He closed the distance between us. My roommate and I, unarmed, stepped aside. There were two of us and only one of him, but neither of us was dumb enough to take on someone wielding a blade. We watched him push through the small crowd and head straight out the front door. It slammed shut behind him. Not even 5 minutes later, two cops showed up at the front door. Outside, on the sidewalk, I could see another pair of officers. They had someone in cuffs. I squinted. It looked like the same guy, but this time, his face was exposed. I guess they pulled off the mask. Seeing him up close, he looked shockingly average. Maybe around 28 or 29, clean-shaven. The kind of guy you wouldn't think twice about passing on the street. The cops told me they nabbed him just down the block. I felt a wave of relief. It had to be him. When they dumped out the contents of his bag, there it was. My laptop, along with the laptops belonging to each of my roommates. He'd also grabbed some other small electronics, probably intending to flip them for quick cash. I mentioned to the officers that he'd pulled a knife on us. I wasn't sure if it would make much of a difference in what they charged him with, but I wanted to make sure they knew the situation could have turned violent. By then, it was nearing midnight. As people started filtering out, the house slowly emptied until it was just the four of us sitting in a mess of empty cups and half-eaten snacks. The adrenaline finally started to wear off, leaving us jittery and drained. We stayed up for another hour, cleaning up and talking about what had gone down. It was easily the most terrifying Halloween I've ever experienced. To this day, I still wonder if he would have really used that knife. Would he have gone through with it if we tried to stop him? I'll never know, and honestly, I'm just glad we didn't find out. When I was 12, I went trick-or-treating with some buddies. It was that awkward age, still young enough to go, but just old enough not to need an adult tagging along. Our suburb was like any other, but there were a few houses that I never really paid attention to. Some folks just didn't mingle much, and that was fine by us. Still, some had their own reasons for keeping to themselves. This is about one of those neighbors. Around 6:45 p.m., my friends Ben, Tim, and Rob were at my place, ready to go. Ben was a pirate, Tim went as a werewolf, and Rob, in his usual lazy way, wore a black hoodie and called himself a shadow. I went as Spider-Man even though I was really skinny back then. My parents were out for a Halloween get-together and wouldn't be back until late. So, with no one around to stop us, we set off into the night. We blitzed through our neighborhood, hitting up every house. Our bags were already half full, but we wanted more. There was another neighborhood about a 15-minute walk away, and none of us had ever gone there before. We decided to check it out. The houses were older, the kind with big porches and lots of windows. I didn't know anyone who lived in that area, but since they had decorations up, it seemed fair game. We spent the next hour or so wandering through the dimly lit streets, stopping at every lit porch. Our bags were nearly bursting at this point, filled with all sorts of candy. But something about that neighborhood felt off, like there was a shadow watching us from behind every curtain and dark corner. It was getting late, so we decided to call it a night and go our separate ways. I headed back home, my candy bag weighing me down with all the treats we scored. I pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The house was completely dark, no sign of my parents yet. They were probably still out at their party. Their car wasn't in the driveway either, so I knew I was alone. I kicked off my shoes and plopped down on the couch, grabbing a piece of candy. I switched on the TV, letting it play quietly as I munched on a few chocolates. Maybe 10 minutes passed before I started feeling kind of off. My stomach churned, and a weird tiredness hit me all of a sudden. I leaned back, resting my head on one of those cushions my mom's obsessed with, trying to shake off the drowsiness. What happened next is a blur. It's like I was stuck between being awake and knocked out. But I remember one thing clearly. A man, tall and shadowy, walked past me. He wasn't my dad. He was too tall, and there was something wrong about him. He moved so slowly, like he was making sure I saw him. Then he leaned down, close enough that I could almost feel his breath, and put a hand on my forehead. After that, nothing. Just black. The next thing I knew, I was standing by the living room window, staring out at the empty driveway. My dad's car still wasn't there. My parents hadn't come home. I stumbled around the house, checking every room, but it was just me, empty and silent. I tried to convince myself I must have imagined it, but it didn't feel like a dream. It couldn't have been. I wasn't that sleepy. It was only around 8:45 p.m. I sat back on the couch, my heart pounding as I tried to piece it all together. None of it made sense. I stared at my candy bag, my mind racing with wild thoughts about poisoned treats or hallucinogenic chocolates. Without thinking, I grabbed the whole bag and dumped it into the trash. After a few shaky breaths, I called up Ben, Tim, and Rob and told them what happened. I practically begged them to throw out their candy just to be safe. I don't know if they believed me or if they thought I'd gone nuts, but that's what I told them. Even now, years later, I still wonder if I really saw that man, or if he was just a trick my mind played on me. It happened on Halloween a few years back. Where I'm from, people say that during this time, spirits come back to visit their loved ones, often showing up as strange insects like big moths. To honor them, folks set out food, light candles, and say prayers, especially those who prefer staying indoors. That night, I decided to light the candles myself. I sat outside by the front door with 5 candles flickering beside me, while everyone else stayed inside. As I watched, the flames began to move, first swaying gently, then bending to one side, as if someone was blowing on them. Not just one, but all 5 candles at once. I froze, staring at the odd sight. I knew it wasn't the wind. The air was thick and still, thanks to a rainstorm that had passed earlier. The trees barely moved, and no one else was around. The flames kept bending, as if being pushed by some invisible force. Fear took over, and before I could make sense of it, I jumped up and ran down the street, away from our house. My heart pounded as I stood there, struggling to catch my breath. After a few minutes, my dad stepped outside, calling me back in for dinner. I cautiously glanced at the candles again. They were back to normal, halfway melted like nothing had happened. I told my family what I'd seen, but they just shrugged it off. The second time something strange happened, I was already married. It was Halloween again, and just like before, I was outside lighting candles on the small porch while holding my youngest son. From where I stood, I could see everything inside the house, since every light was on. We'd finished dinner early, so my wife was upstairs putting our older son to bed. Our helper was still in the kitchen, tidying up, and my dad was in the living room, glued to the TV. The kitchen isn't far from the bathroom, just a few steps, so if someone walked between the two, you could see them clearly. As I stood outside, enjoying the cool night air, I saw someone pass by. Looked like a woman. She walked from the bathroom toward the kitchen, and I swear I saw her back. I called out to our helper, "Gina, switch off the kitchen lights when you're done." But then, I heard her voice coming from upstairs through the window saying, "I'm not done yet, Kuya." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I felt an icy chill creep up my spine. I quickly turned to my dad and asked if my mom was in the kitchen, hoping he'd confirm. "Nope, no one's there," he said casually, not even glancing up from the TV. My heart raced as I rushed inside, headed straight upstairs to tell my wife. She just told me to keep it down, saying, "It's fine, let it go." Later on, she admitted she'd seen the same figure herself, the same woman, moving outside by the fence. Except she didn't walk through any walls or the gate. It was like she just appeared on the other side. This happened roughly 11 years back when I was a freshman at a small college in New Haven, Connecticut. Not long after classes began, I found myself a part of a tight group of drama lovers. 7 of us in total, 6 guys and 1 girl. Everyone was obsessed with horror flicks and ghost stories. It felt like I'd finally found my people. College life was tough at times, but we kept each other going, making the whole experience more bearable. At the start of sophomore year, we made a plan to celebrate the Halloween season in the best way possible. Our idea? Head to a nearby creepy forest one night and scare ourselves silly. We did some research and found a secluded spot about 40 minutes away, known for eerie occurrences. It sounded perfect for what we wanted. We split into 2 cars and drove out there one chilly October evening. Let me paint you a picture of this place. We turned off a busy street filled with shops and diners and were swallowed by a pitch-black road almost immediately. The woods around were so dense they seemed to eat up any light. It was like a giant maze of narrow, winding paths lined with towering trees. There were barely any streetlights and only a few houses here and there. If you didn't have GPS or a solid grasp of the area, you'd get hopelessly lost. We all made sure our phones were fully charged, and we carried flashlights just in case. The idea was to keep driving until we all felt it was time to pull over and explore. After following the directions, we veered off the main road and drove for what felt like ages. We chose turns at random, trying to lose ourselves on purpose. At one point, we made a left turn and came across a huge fallen tree blocking the path. We had hit a dead end, and beyond it, there was nothing but an endless stretch of woods. We climbed out of the cars, curious. The log was massive, and right behind it, we noticed 2 narrow, barely visible trails leading deeper into the woods. It seemed like a good time to grab our flashlights and dive into our impromptu ghost hunt. We tossed a coin and ended up taking the trail on the right. It was so narrow that we had to walk in a single line, each of us pushing branches out of our faces as we went. Somehow, I got stuck at the very back of the line. Usually, I'm the calm one in the group, but the deeper we ventured, the more I started to feel uneasy. I kept hearing these soft noises coming from somewhere far off in the woods. It was almost like faint whispers or maybe twigs snapping underfoot, but no one else seemed to notice. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, the whole reason we were out there was to freak ourselves out. Besides, there were 7 of us. What could possibly be out here that we couldn't handle? We kept trudging along for what felt like forever. Just when I thought the trail would go on indefinitely, we stumbled into a huge clearing. It was enormous, like imagine a football field, but wilder, with tall, untrimmed grass. The forest seemed to wrap around the entire clearing, like some sort of barrier, and the open space was so vast that we couldn't even see the far end of it from where we stood. I was just relieved to be out of that cramped trail, but none of us had expected to find a place this big. That's when someone shouted, "Look over there!" We all turned and saw it, a crumbling old house, maybe 300 yards away. It looked completely abandoned, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. There were no lights, no cars, nothing that hinted at anyone having been there in years. We walked closer, shining our flashlights on it. The windows and doors were all boarded up, but I managed to peek between the planks on one of the windows. Inside, there was just an old couch draped in plastic. Other than that, the room was empty. Whoever had lived there clearly hadn't been back in a long, long time. After failing to find any way in, we decided to head back toward the trail we came in on and just sit down in the field. We needed to figure out what we wanted to do next. But before we could settle down, my friend Rob suddenly froze, his gaze locked on something in the distance. "Guys, did you see that?" he whispered, barely moving. We all turned to where he was looking, and there, at the edge of the clearing, just past the tree line, we thought we saw a faint, flickering light. It wasn't like a flashlight or phone screen. It was more like an old lantern's glow, bobbing gently up and down. It moved slowly, weaving in and out of the trees, and then it just disappeared. We stood there, staring, unsure of what to say or do. My pulse was racing, and I could tell from everyone's tense silence that they were just as freaked out as I was. "Okay, so we all saw that, right?" I finally managed to get out. A few shaky nods were all I got in response. After a minute, we decided we were curious enough to get a closer look. We cautiously made our way toward where we'd seen the light, every branch snap and leaf crunch underfoot feeling like thunder in the still night. When we reached the edge of the clearing, there was nothing there. No light, no footprints, just the dense darkness of the woods. We looked at each other, unsure if we should keep going or head back. Then Rob, still a little pale, suggested we call it a night and head back to the cars. But as we turned around, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. This time, it was so intense, it was almost suffocating. My hands felt clammy as I slowly turned my head, scanning the tree line. There, standing just a few feet inside the woods, was a shadowy figure. His face went pale, and he lifted his hand, pointing straight ahead. All of us turned to look. There, on the far side of the field, opposite from where we came in, was something. It looked like a person, tall, weirdly skinny, and super pale, moving in and out of the trees. But it wasn't walking. It was prancing, almost playfully. It would grab a tree, swing around it, then move to the next one, like it was doing some twisted kind of dance. The moonlight hit it just right, making it stand out against the blackness of the woods behind it. We all froze for a second, struggling to make sense of what we were seeing. Ben, the biggest skeptic in our group, was squinting at it, still unconvinced. I elbowed him and whispered, "Dude, look right where I'm pointing. You seriously don't see that?" He tilted his head, stared hard, and when he finally saw it, he gripped my arm tight and whispered, "What the hell is that?" His voice sounded tiny and shaky, like he'd just seen a ghost. But then, something happened that made my stomach drop. The figure stopped its bizarre dance and turned its head, as if it had suddenly noticed us. It paused for just a split second, then started running right toward us. My brain barely had time to register what was going on before panic kicked in. We bolted for the trail, the sound of pounding feet and snapping branches filling the air. Ben, still not fully grasping what was going on, shouted after us, "What's happening? Why are you guys running?" It wasn't until he finally saw it coming our way that I heard him yell, "Holy shit!" His flashlight beam swayed wildly as he sprinted to catch up. It took us nearly 20 minutes to get there on foot, but we somehow made it back to our cars in less than 5, hearts pounding, adrenaline driving us forward. We jumped in, slammed the doors, and took off, tearing down the dark, winding roads like our lives depended on it. When we finally got far enough away to breathe again, we pulled over and stumbled out of the cars, gasping and shaking. We all looked at each other, wide-eyed and still in shock. No one said anything for a long moment, until one of us finally broke the silence with, "What just happened?" Even after all these years, that night's etched into my memory. We're all scattered across the country now, busy with our lives. But every now and then, someone in the group will text, "Remember the woods?" It's like we need that confirmation from one another that it was real. And every time we all respond the same way. Yeah, that happened. No doubt. What haunts me the most is how fearless that person, or thing, was. Alone, deep in the woods at 1 in the morning, and it still charged at a group of 7 people like it was nothing. Did it know we were there all along, watching us? Was it the same sound I'd been hearing on the trail earlier? Or worse, had it been following us the whole time, biding its time until we noticed? Whatever it was, it didn't care that it was outnumbered. It came right for us, full speed, like it knew exactly what it was doing. That's what still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. None of us wanted to stay and find out what might have happened if it caught up to us, and I'm sure I'll never stop wondering. After listening to some creepy Halloween tales, it brought back a memory of something weird that happened when I was 17. For context, I'm a guy, and I was out trick-or-treating with 3 of my friends, L, M, and K. We wanted to make it a special night for 2 reasons. 1, this was probably our last time going around asking for candy because we felt like we were getting too old. And 2, we figured this might be one of the last nights we'd all hang out together since our lives were about to get crazy with college applications and jobs. I guess we were right, but not for the reason we thought. We ended up wandering down a street we didn't usually go down, and that's when we saw it. The house was decked out in so many decorations that it looked like a movie set. At first, we weren't even sure if it was an actual home or some kind of haunted house attraction. We walked up cautiously, and before we could knock, the door swung open. This guy stepped out, didn't look at us, and just muttered, "Sorry, no more candy." That was enough to send us walking the other way without a word. It felt off. We kept going, deciding to call it a night and head back to M's place. As we were walking, Kay stopped dead and whispered, Guys? Who is that?" We turned and saw a dark figure standing about 50 feet back. We laughed it off at first, thinking it was just another trick-or-treater. But he didn't move. He stayed right there, watching us. We shrugged and kept walking. It was probably nothing. 10 minutes later, we were back at M's house, and his parents were out, so we made ourselves at home in his room, playing some games. Then we heard a soft thud. We froze. "Did you guys hear that?" M asked. And then we saw him. The same guy from earlier was at the window, fiddling with the latch like he was trying to pry it open. My heart was pounding. But I was the fastest on the track team. So I ran up and slammed the window shut with so much force that I thought I might break it. Without thinking, I opened it just enough to kick him square in the chest. He stumbled back and took off running down the driveway. We stayed up the rest of the night just in case he came back. We didn't call the police. No idea why. Maybe we didn't think they'd take us seriously. But it didn't matter. We never saw him again after that. Good thing too, because I'm not sure what would have happened if we had. It was the night of Halloween in 2013, and I was 14 years old. Since I was little, I'd always gone trick-or-treating with the same group of friends. We all went to the same small school, so it wasn't like we had a lot of other kids to hang out with anyway. Our town was quiet, with barely any crime, so we'd been allowed to wander by ourselves since we were about 11. Looking back now, I know we were too trusting. With what I know today, I'd handle things differently. Once we were all dressed in our costumes, I met up with my friends at my place. My mom handed me a cell phone to carry, even though I didn't have my own yet. She always insisted I take it whenever I went somewhere without an adult. There were 3 of us, me and my buddies, Kevin and Sam. We didn't bother with anything fancy for costumes. I was dressed as a pirate, but I honestly can't recall what the other guys were wearing. It was around 7 in the evening, and the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The streets were starting to darken, but the streetlights kept everything lit up pretty well. Our neighborhood was laid out in a neat pattern of streets lined with houses. At the far end, there was a tiny patch of forest and a creek, with our middle school just beyond that. We walked from house to house, filling our bags with candy. It was all going smoothly until a car crept up behind us, driving slowly. There was just one man inside, dressed in this bizarre, overly elaborate clown outfit. It looked way too detailed to be something you'd pick up at the store, almost like a pro costume. As he drove past us, I noticed his makeup was half smeared, like he'd been wearing it for hours. It gave me the creeps, and I could tell my friends felt the same. He stared at us for a long moment, but never stopped. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 20 seconds, he turned down another street and vanished from sight. I glanced over at Kevin, and he looked uneasy too, but none of us said anything. We kept on knocking on doors for another hour or so, but by about 9 most of the houses were dark. Usually, that means the fun is over. We decided to hit up just one more house, but when we knocked on the door, no one came out to answer. After that, we figured it was time to wrap up the trick-or-treating for the night. By then, we'd wandered close to the woods, just a few houses away from the old high school. We were still buzzing with energy, and none of us wanted to call it a night just yet. We knew our parents wouldn't start to worry until around 9:30 or 10 tor, so we agreed to hang out a bit longer and dig into our stash of candy. I suggested we head over to the school playground. The streets had plenty of light, but the school grounds were almost pitch dark. Once we made it through the gate, we could hardly see anything around us. After a couple of minutes, our eyes got used to the darkness, and we walked over to the basketball courts. There was a long, worn-out bench on the side, so we sat down and started chatting. We'd only been there for about 10 minutes when we noticed someone coming towards us. Sam was the first to see him and pointed him out. I instantly thought we were going to get in trouble for being at the school after hours. The figure moved closer, and soon enough, we could tell it was a man. He was huge, easily over 6 feet tall, and he was wearing, of all things, a clown costume. The second I saw him, I felt a chill. I remembered that creepy dude in the car from earlier, and I just knew it was him. He came right up to us. His face was smeared with white makeup, but he didn't have the crazy wig or hat you'd expect on a clown. From the neck down, though, he was dressed head to toe in full clown gear, complete with the oversized shoes. My friends and I stopped talking, frozen in place, staring at him. He broke the silence first, saying something like, "Hey there, guys. How's your night been?" None of us replied. I could feel my phone buzzing in my pocket. I'd left it on vibrate, so I knew someone was calling, but I was too freaked out to check it. The clown leaned forward a bit, a strange smile on his face, and said, "I've got a bunch of candy left over from this party I was at. You guys want some? Just come with me." He pointed over to the street, and I could see his car, half hidden in the shadows near the school entrance. The buzzing in my pocket turned frantic. Maybe it was calls. Maybe it was texts. I couldn't tell. We glanced at each other. None of us trusted this guy, but we were just kids. We didn't know what to do or how to get away without making things worse. Out of nowhere, Kevin suddenly took off running, heading the opposite way. Looking back, it was the smartest move any of us could have made. There was no chance that guy would catch us, not in those ridiculous clown shoes. Sam and I didn't hesitate. We bolted right after Kevin. When we reached the back end of the playground, the gate was shut tight. We paused for a second, catching our breath, and glanced back. The clown was about 100 feet away, not running, just steadily walking toward us. We scrambled up and over the fence, landing on the other side in a small patch of woods that bordered the school grounds. There was a dirt trail along the fence, so we ran in the direction away from the parked car. By the time we hit the sidewalk again, I finally felt like we were a bit safer. That's when I remembered my phone and checked it. I had 6 missed calls, all from my mom, and a few texts too. I opened one of the messages. It just said, "Come home now," in big, angry letters. We split up, each of us sprinting toward our own houses. It took me maybe 10 minutes to get home, and when I did, my mom was standing on the porch, tears streaming down her face. She pulled me into a tight hug as soon as I stepped up to the door. That's when I noticed there were 2 police cars driving slowly around our block, lights flashing. I still didn't get what was going on, but I was about to find out. My mom asked me where I'd been, and I told her the whole story about the guy at the school. She went pale, then immediately grabbed her phone and called the cops. They were at our house in less than 5 minutes. The officers took me outside and asked me to describe everything about the man and his car. They stayed for about 10 minutes, writing down every detail I could remember before heading out. It turned out that earlier that night, there was an attempted kidnapping. A kid a few years younger than us had almost been taken by a man in a clown costume, just a few blocks away from the school. Thankfully, the boy's mother was there and managed to scare the guy off before calling the police. My mom had been blowing up my phone all night because she knew something was wrong, and I was out there without an adult. As far as I know, the clown guy was never caught. But that was the only time anything like that ever happened in our neighborhood. I lived there until I finished high school, and we never saw or heard of anything similar again. Halloween's supposed to be spooky and fun, a night for harmless scares. But that night, that was something else entirely. It went way beyond just a scare. It was real fear, the kind that sticks with you long after it's over. It was a few Halloweens ago, maybe when I was around 10 or 11. My buddy Max and I would always hit the streets for candy while our folks stayed back to hand out treats. Every year, it was the same. Max's mom would come along, keeping an eye on us. We were just starting to feel that rebellious itch, though, and tried to distance ourselves from her every chance we got. This particular year, she was juggling her time between us and Max's baby brother, which meant we had more freedom than usual. After about an hour of hopping from house to house, we noticed a kid coming up to us. His name was Greg, and he asked if he could tag along. He was taller than both of us and seemed older, maybe 13 or so. That probably explained why he wasn't with a parent. Greg was rocking a pretty detailed werewolf costume, complete with fur that looked almost real. Probably just some cheap fabric, but impressive nonetheless. Max agreed almost instantly, and I didn't see a reason to say no either. We hadn't seen Greg around school, but hanging out with someone older always felt cool, like it somehow made us look more grown up. At that point, Max's mom was at least 8 houses behind, so it was just the 3 of us. We kept moving through the neighborhood, filling our bags with candy. Greg seemed pretty chill. He liked the same games and music we did, and he wasn't trying to boss us around or anything. After a while, Greg stopped and said, "Hey, there's another neighborhood nearby with houses closer together. We'll get way more candy if we head over there." Max's eyes lit up. "Really? How do we get there?" Greg shrugged, grinning. "We can take my dad's car. He doesn't mind me using it." I knew Greg seemed older, but driving a car, that felt way off. My stomach churned, and for a moment I thought about backing out. But Max was all in. His eyes practically sparkled. It was like he was thrilled to have a new, cool friend, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin that. You know how it goes with friends sometimes. You just don't want to be the odd one out. So, I nodded, even though every part of me was screaming not to. We followed Greg down a couple of blocks until we reached his car. It was a dark blue Honda with blackout windows, like one of those cars that makes you think twice before walking too close. Greg clicked his key fob, and the doors popped open. He slid into the driver's seat and took off his mask. Max didn't hesitate. He walked around to the passenger side like it was no big deal. Meanwhile, I slowly opened the back door, but as I leaned in, something caught my eye. When I saw his face, really saw it, I nearly dropped the bag of candy I was holding. Greg wasn't some kid. He had to be at least 40, maybe older. His hair had strands of gray in it, and his eyes? Something about them looked wrong, like they didn't belong in a costume at all. My mind froze for a split second, then panic took over. Without even thinking, I turned and bolted. I didn't yell for Max. I didn't even try to explain what I saw. I just ran, legs burning as I put as much distance between me and that car as possible. Max found me a few minutes later, gasping for air. "What happened, man?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I saw you take off and thought..." I don't know what I thought. But then Greg started the car and sped off. I just knew I had to get out. We stood there in silence for a long time, just trying to catch our breath. I didn't know what to say, and Max looked like he was struggling to process everything too. We ended up heading back home, not talking much. We didn't tell anyone about it either. Not our parents, not our friends. It felt too messed up to talk about. Sometimes I think about that night, wondering what the guy had in mind. Dressing up and pretending to be one of us? It's something that stuck with me. Halloween is supposed to be about fake scares and silly costumes. But what we felt? That was way too real. It's early October and I'm already feeling that Halloween excitement creep in. I love this holiday more than any other. Dressing up, partying, getting lost in the spooky vibes. A week before Halloween, though, things were off. One evening, I just decided, screw it. My study group canceled because of a last-minute project deadline. I felt annoyed and didn't want to just waste the night sitting around. I thought maybe shooting some hoops at the old court by the park would help clear my mind. That park, barely anyone ever goes there, so it's my little escape spot. It's kind of hidden and quiet, and something about the way the moonlight hits the pavement always makes me feel at peace. I knew some exercise would do the trick. Once I got there, just like I expected, the place was totally empty. The only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves. There's this trail that runs off from the court, leads to a dense, hilly area. Usually I like that it's deserted because I can focus, not worrying about people watching. I debated putting in my earbuds but decided against it. Darkness falls fast in this part of town, and it's smarter to stay aware of what's going on around you. The sky turned this beautiful shade of pink and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. Everything felt perfect. I was in my zone. But then, as night settled in, I was just about to finish up when it happened. A scream. A shrill, blood-curdling scream that cut through the air. It seemed like it came from somewhere on the trail. Before I could process it, there was laughter. Twisted, maniacal laughter. So, I'm standing there, feeling pretty freaked out. But I don't see anyone. Not a single person. I keep telling myself, just a few more shots, then head home. Then, out of nowhere, a car pulls into the lot. The headlights flash across the court before it parks. A weird feeling creeps up my spine. I decide to head to the bathroom by the court, thinking I'll just do my thing and then get the hell out. While I'm there, trying to stay calm, I suddenly hear this low, raspy whisper from the stall next to me. My heart skips a beat. What the hell? Could be some junkie, a homeless guy, or some unhinged person hiding out. I'm trying to act normal, but I'm sweating bullets. I quickly finish up, and as I'm leaving I hear a car door slam shut. I peek around the corner of the building, just trying to get a look at who's there. Then I freeze. 2 clowns, dressed in those creepy oversized suits with painted-on smiles, are strolling toward the court, and then they veer off toward that secluded trail. My stomach drops. Should I follow them? Something in me wants to, like I'm being pulled by some morbid curiosity. But then, I think, nah, that's just asking for trouble. I grab my backpack and throw it over my shoulder, ready to make a quick exit. I speed walk to my car, unlock it, and jump inside, hands shaking as I fumble for my phone. I shoot a text to my buddies, saying I'll be online later. But just as I'm about to drive off, I see someone sitting on the bench by the court. It's too dark to make out the face, but I know it's got to be the person from the bathroom. My nerves are shot at this point. I don't care to find out who they are. I crank the engine and pull out of the lot, feeling my breath finally come back as I speed toward my apartment. And that's pretty much it. I know it's not the scariest thing ever, but you gotta remember, this was during that weird period back in 2016, when all those creepy clown sightings were happening everywhere. It was just this eerie encounter I've never quite shaken off. I don't know if I would have been fine if I stayed longer, and honestly, I'm glad I didn't find out. Who knows, though? Maybe those clown sightings will start popping up again someday. I'm not sure how to start this, and I'm sorry if it sounds confusing. The story you're about to read is what happened to me a couple of Halloweens ago. I don't like bringing it up, but my friend keeps insisting it might help to get it out in the open. We got invited to this college party at a mansion in the wealthy side of town. The place was massive, with a huge backyard and a pool. The party's theme was seductive, so my friend went as a risque nurse, while I chose a belly dancer costume. There must have been around 60 to 70 people, but the house was so big it didn't feel crowded. I'm not much of a drinker, but I had some fruit punch since everyone was pushing me to have fun. At some point, a group of people asked us to take pictures, so I set my cup down and joined in. We must have been taking photos for what felt like forever. Eventually, I went back for my drink and took a sip without even thinking about how long it had been left out. A guy I didn't recognize walked up to me. He seemed older, maybe late 20s, early 30s. He said my boyfriend's name and mentioned he'd been trying to reach me. That's when I realized I didn't have my phone with me. I felt guilty because I'd promised to check in since my boyfriend had to work that night. The man looked worried and said it was urgent. He offered me his phone to call from one of the upstairs rooms. I didn't think twice about it. If my boyfriend really needed to get a hold of me, it had to be important. So I followed him. As soon as I stepped into the room, though, I felt like all the energy had been sucked out of me. He shut the door quietly behind us. I was already feeling dizzy and sat down on the bed. He handed me his phone, but my fingers were numb and I could barely dial. I felt weaker with every second, like a heavy fog was settling in my head. He helped me lie back, and before I knew it, everything went dark. I woke up much later, with no clue where I was or what happened. When I came to, I saw my friend leaning over me, wiping something off my stomach with a napkin. She was panicking, muttering under her breath. It took a few seconds to really understand what was happening. I realized I was still in a bedroom, lying on a bed, with my friend trying to clean me up. That's when the panic hit, my chest tightening as I processed what this could mean. I felt sick, wondering if something terrible had been done to me. My friend tried to calm me down, swearing that nothing too bad had happened. She explained she had lost track of me during the party. After searching for a while, she thought I'd just gone to the bathroom or outside for fresh air. But when I didn't show up for a while, she started getting worried and decided to check the rooms. That's when she found me. passed out on the bed with that guy from earlier. She said he was bent over me, his mouth pressed against my belly button. He was using my unconscious body for some twisted drinking game, taking shots off me, sucking alcohol out of my belly button, licking salt from my chest, and then kissing me. My friend wasn't sure how long it had been going on, but when she walked in, he looked like he was just getting started. Hearing this made me want to vomit. I was shaking, tears filling my eyes. I felt gross, disgusted. How could I have let this happen? Just as I started spiraling, my friend told me that she'd already called my boyfriend. He'd finished his shift early and was on his way to pick me up. She'd tried asking around about the guy, but no one knew him or remembered seeing him arrive. He was just some ghost that had slipped into the party unnoticed. When my boyfriend arrived, I could barely look at him. He was furious, but tried to hold it together for my sake. He and my friend helped me out of the house, and they took me straight to urgent care. I just wanted to get out of there, to leave that place and forget the whole night. At the clinic, they ran some tests. Thankfully, the drug that had knocked me out didn't seem to have caused any permanent damage, but the feeling of helplessness lingered long after. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but a few days later, I started getting texts from an unknown number. At first, the messages were random. Things like, "How's your day?" or "Did you miss me?" I ignored them, thinking it was some prank or spam. But then he sent a photo of my own stomach. My heart dropped when I saw it. He'd taken the picture at that party, in that bedroom. The texts quickly shifted from vague comments to outright threats, saying he was watching me, that he knew where I lived. I felt trapped. I tried blocking the number, but he kept finding new ways to reach me. The thought of going to the police crossed my mind, but I didn't have any real evidence aside from the texts, and I didn't want to draw more attention to myself. I thought about trying to lure him out somehow, setting up a trap to catch him. But I didn't know how dangerous he was or if he'd show up at all. It's been months, and the messages still come sometimes. Each time I feel that same chill run down my spine, wondering if he's outside my window or watching from a distance. I don't know who he is or what he's capable of, and that's the worst part. This is the first time I'm opening up about this incident since it happened. I'm 21 now, but even though a few years have passed, the memories are still vivid. I've had my share of freaky and distressing experiences, enough for at least 2 lives. Despite my age, I've always been quick to catch on to things happening around me. That's just how I've been. I live in a small town in upstate New York, not far from the Adirondack Mountains. This story happened back in middle school, 8th grade, I think. I've changed the names for obvious reasons, but the details are still the same. My friend Lily threw a little Halloween get-together at her place. There were 8 of us all together. Lily, myself, and 6 others. Megan, Sarah, Emma, Anna, Jack, and Nick. We spent the evening taking photos in our costumes before we took Lily's younger cousin out for some trick-or-treating around the neighborhood. This wasn't the kind of place where bad stuff happened. It was a quiet neighborhood with neat lawns and friendly neighbors. After dropping Lily's cousin back home, we went inside to grab some sweaters since the air had turned chilly. We weren't ready to call it a night yet, so we decided to wander around a bit more. Lily grabbed a small Bluetooth speaker, and we all started walking, the music playing softly, just loud enough to hear if you were close by. By now, it was around 9:30 p.m., and most of the kids had already headed back home. We didn't run into anyone else on the street. Eventually, we ended up at a small park near Lily's house. It wasn't far from the road, but the playground itself was set back behind a big grassy area. You couldn't really see it unless you were standing at the right spot or knew it was there. Tall trees surrounded the play area, casting long shadows that made it seem hidden and far away. We dropped our phones on a bench along with Lily's speaker and made our way over to the swings and slides. Everyone was in their own little groups, chatting away. With 8 people, there was a lot going on. I was sitting next to Lily and Emma on the playground, while Sarah, Megan, Anna, and Jack were lounging on those metal bars meant for climbing. Nick was the only one hanging back, leaning against the side of the play structure. Then we all noticed a few people walking out of the tree line by the sidewalk, maybe 40 yards away. They had their hoods up, and while they didn't seem to be doing much, just strolling along, something felt off. We didn't pay them much mind at first and kept talking. But then, suddenly, everything went silent. Out of nowhere, Emma jumped up and bolted from the playground. Within seconds, I saw Sarah, Megan, Anna, Jack, and Nick take off too. It all happened so fast. I was left there with Lily, the both of us confused and sitting in the shadows. Turning around, I saw them, 5 or 6 figures, all dressed in black, wearing creepy masks. Each one held something in their hands, long knives or maybe metal bats. They weren't running, but they were moving quickly, like they had a purpose. The way they carried themselves, like they knew exactly what they were going to do, sent shivers down my spine. And for anyone wondering how I could tell they were men, it was obvious. They were huge, their shoulders broad and their stance aggressive. I looked at Lily. Her face mirrored the terror I was feeling. How could our friends just leave us like that without a word? It felt like they'd all just abandoned us. The men were now at the park bench where we'd left our phones and Lily's speaker. Still walking fast, getting closer and closer. I saw Lily make a split-second decision, and without thinking, she ran toward the bench to grab her speaker. All I could think was how stupid that was, but I couldn't let her go alone. If something happened to her because of a speaker, I'd never forgive myself. I waited as she scrambled back to me, clutching the speaker like it was the most precious thing in the world. We stood there, panic rising, trying to figure out where to go. The park felt like a trap, surrounded by trees, and the only way out seemed to lead right past the men. I glanced around, looking for our friends, and saw them climbing over some large rocks that led up to a chain-link fence. Beyond that fence was nothing but forest. That's when I saw 2 of the masked men start heading in their direction, their footsteps crunching against the gravel as they picked up speed. My mind was racing because I knew the other men were closing in on us from behind. Lily and I bolted toward the far end of the fence, knowing we wouldn't be able to scramble up the rocks in time. Lily managed to slip through to the other side, joining the rest of our group, but I wasn't so lucky. Being just 5'0", I was really struggling to climb over. I glanced back, and 2 of the masked men were sprinting straight for me, noticing I was stuck. I don't know how I did it, but just seconds before one of them could grab me, I pulled myself up and over. Once I hit the ground, I didn't stop. I had no idea where anyone else was. It was just me in the shadows. The men were getting ready to jump the fence to follow me, so I took off running again, trying to keep low. I knew the other 3 were still out there somewhere, and I had no clue if they'd caught up to my friends or what. The only thing on my mind was finding a house, any house, with its lights on. Luck was on my side, because after darting through the trees and backyard, I spotted one. I sprinted across the grass and started banging on their back door, not caring how insane I must have looked. They were having a party too, so it didn't take long for someone to answer. I blurted out everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it all. A few guys from the party stepped outside and headed back toward the woods to find the men and check on my friends. Thankfully, all of my friends had made it to the house by then, but we were still shaken up. The women inside called the cops, while the guys stayed outside. About 10 minutes later, they came back, but one of them was holding his face. He'd been punched. The police showed up shortly after and checked around the entire area where we'd been. They didn't spot anyone suspicious or wandering around, but they did find all our phones still sitting on the park bench where we left them. It might not sound too terrifying now, but for us, in that moment, it was real. Those guys had weapons, and they didn't try to rob us. They easily could have taken our phones. Whatever their plan was, it wasn't good. To this day, I have no idea who they were or why they were out there stalking a bunch of kids with masks and knives. One thing's for sure, though. I've never gone back to that park after dark, and I don't think I ever will. If you're thinking about hanging out in empty parks late at night, take my advice and just don't. It's not worth finding out who or what might be waiting for you. I've always looked forward to Halloween, but last year something happened that made me almost hate it. I was 23 back then, living alone in a small ground-floor apartment that was part of a split-level house. My place and the other apartment shared a wall, and the entrances were right next to each other. The landlord, an older guy named Frank, lived in the other unit, but he was out of town for a few weeks. There were always kids around, and even though I wasn't into trick-or-treating anymore, I liked handing out candy to the neighborhood kids. That Halloween night, I had stocked up on a ton of candy. Some of my neighbors were families I knew pretty well, so I made sure to be one of the cooler houses with better treats. But the weather was awful, heavy rain all evening. I wasn't sure how many kids would show up. I remembered a Halloween years back when we got hit by a freak snowstorm, and everything got pushed back a week. It was weird, but at least everyone still got their Halloween. This time it seemed like it was still on. Around 6:12 p.m., the first trick-or-treaters showed up. Just a small group of boys, maybe 9 to 11 years old. One of them was a kid from 2 blocks over, so I recognized him. They were soaked but giggling and having fun. I handed out some candy. They ran off, and that's when I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked just down the street. It had 3 guys inside, all wearing masks. I thought they were just on their way to a party or something, so I didn't think too much about it. An hour passed, and the car was still there, just sitting in the same spot. A few more kids came by, and every time I opened the door, I saw the car and those same guys. It was a bit unsettling, but they weren't doing anything suspicious, just sitting there. By 7:30, I figured no one else was coming, so I plopped down on my couch and put on an old horror movie. I'd made it a tradition to watch a couple of horror films on Halloween, munching on the leftover candy. It was nearly 10 p.m. when I was halfway through The Exorcist that I heard a knock on the door. Strange, I thought. It was way too late for trick-or-treaters. The rain had eased up by then, but was still coming down lightly. I peeked through the window beside the door and saw 2 tall guys standing on the porch. They weren't kids. They looked like grown men. I hesitated, but slowly made my way to the door. I couldn't see their faces clearly because they had hoods pulled low and seemed to be whispering to each other. I felt a chill run down my spine. As I got closer, I peered out through the bigger window next to my front door and noticed there were 3 of them. They looked about my age, maybe 22 or 23, wearing Halloween costumes that didn't match at all. One guy was dressed as some sort of elf, or maybe it was a gnome, I couldn't really tell. Another one was decked out in a superhero outfit, but I had no idea who he was supposed to be. The third guy had on a plain, old-school mask, the kind you'd buy at a dollar store last minute. My eyes shifted back to the street, and I saw that same car still parked there. Now it was empty, and I was certain these were the guys who had been sitting in it earlier. As I was trying to get a better look, one of them caught me staring. "Yo, man, does Ryan live here?" he called out, sounding way too casual for someone knocking on a stranger's door this late. No. I think you have the wrong place," I replied, trying to sound just as chill. He nodded, said something to his friends, and they all turned and walked off towards the car. Seemed innocent enough, but why were they hanging out here for hours, just sitting in that car? Maybe they had left and come back, but either way, it made my skin crawl a little. Trying to shake off the weird vibes, I went back to finish the movie. Then I started another one, just to calm my nerves. By midnight, I decided it was time to call it a night. Lying in bed around 12:30 a.m., I was still awake when I heard faint noises coming from my porch. It sounded like someone was messing with the front door of the other apartment. But that couldn't be right. My landlord wasn't supposed to return for a couple more days. Too curious to ignore it, I crept over to my front door and glanced outside. No one was on my porch, but the car was back in its old spot. This time, there was just one guy sitting in the driver's seat. It was hard to make out his face, but I had a gut feeling it was one of the guys from earlier. That's when I started hearing movement next door. The walls between our units were thin enough that I could tell people were walking around inside my landlord's place, at least 2, maybe more. My stomach dropped. There was no way anyone was supposed to be in there. It hit me like a brick. It had to be a break-in. Heart racing, I dialed 911 as quietly as I could and whispered into the phone, telling them someone was robbing my neighbor. I gave them the address and begged them to hurry up. Every second felt like an hour as I waited. I could hear drawers being opened and furniture shifting. Whoever was in there didn't seem to be in any rush. A few minutes later, I heard a car pulling up and saw the flashing red and blue lights spilling into my apartment. I felt a little relief, but my biggest fear was that I'd hear a gunshot or something worse. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened to the muffled voices. Then I peeked out the window. I saw two figures being escorted out in cuffs. I didn't have to see their faces to know who they were, the same two guys who had been at my door just a few hours before. I'm almost certain they knocked on my door to see if anyone was home. If I hadn't answered, I might have been the one getting robbed instead of my landlord. But they didn't count on me being able to hear everything through these paper-thin walls. If I hadn't noticed or acted, they probably would have gotten away without a trace. I was 15 when this happened. It was mid-October, and I'd just found out that people thought I was too old for trick-or-treating. I felt a little let down, but part of me was ready to move on. Dressing up had been fun for a while, but I guess it was time to try something different. Still, Halloween was always my favorite time of year, and it felt wrong not to do anything for it. So, I got together with my best friends, Sean and Derek, to brainstorm ideas. Sean, being a year younger, still wanted to go out for candy. But Derek and I convinced him otherwise. Kind of had to. We ended up sitting in the school cafeteria, tossing ideas around like usual. Derek was into these paranormal shows and suggested we visit the old graveyard at the edge of town. Neither Sean nor I really believed in that stuff, but nobody had a better plan. So, why not? We decided to meet up at my place around 7 p.m. After some snacks, we started our walk down the dimly lit streets. The neighborhood was buzzing with costumed kids and excited chatter. Even though we'd left trick-or-treating behind, the vibe made me nostalgic. My town was one of those places where Halloween was a big deal. Practically every house had decorations up, with spiderwebs, plastic skeletons, and eerie lighting. It brought back a lot of good memories of when I was younger. The cemetery wasn't far, maybe a 15-minute walk. We cracked jokes along the way, talking about dumb stuff we'd done on previous Halloweens. None of us wore costumes this time. We just didn't see the point if we weren't getting candy. I never really cared for dressing up anyway. It was just a means to get sweets. When we got to the cemetery, the gate was as tall and rusty as I remembered. Locked, of course. But there was a spot around the back where the fence dipped down. After a quick glance around, we scaled it easily. Once inside, we just stood there for a minute, looking at each other. A mix of thrill and nervousness filled the silence. We weren't really scared of ghosts. More like we were nervous because we knew we weren't supposed to be there. We strolled past tombstones so old the names had worn off. This cemetery hadn't seen a new burial in years, and only a small maintenance crew came by to cut the grass every now and then. Walking through it at night made it feel like the air was heavier somehow. We kept chatting, laughing at random stuff, until we heard a sound, a low, constant hum coming from somewhere deeper in. All three of us froze and exchanged curious looks. "Guess we found our first spirit," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Sean and Derek chuckled, but it was more of a forced laugh. We all knew it wasn't anything supernatural, but that didn't stop us from wanting to check it out. The hum got louder as we walked, turning into a soft, rhythmic chant. It sounded like voices, too many voices for it to be just a couple of people. We stepped closer, moving slower now. And then we saw them. Maybe 10 or so figures clustered together in the farthest corner of the cemetery. They stood in a tight circle, all dressed in dark outfits and wearing some kind of masks. In the middle of their circle was someone lying flat on the ground, completely still. I squinted, trying to catch a word or two of their chanting, but it was like they were speaking another language or something. Every word sent a chill down my spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't some harmless Halloween prank. "Dude, we should get out of here," Sean whispered, his voice shaky. Derek just nodded, his eyes wide and glued to the scene. I didn't need any more convincing. We all turned around and made our way back the way we came, making sure to keep our steps quiet. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. When we finally got over the fence and back onto the brightly lit street, it felt like I could breathe again. We never mentioned what we saw to anyone else, but we couldn't help talking about it amongst ourselves. Sean tried to convince us they were just older kids messing around, but I wasn't buying it. There was something about the way they chanted, the way that person on the ground didn't move. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite explain. I don't know what those people were doing in that cemetery that night, and I'm thankful we didn't stick around to find out. This story probably won't freak you out as much as some of the others here, but at the time, I was completely terrified. It happened in late October of 2005 when I was 12 years old and in the 5th grade. Where I grew up, our middle schools ended their day later than both the elementary and high schools. So my friends and I knew that if we wanted to score any candy, we'd have to get moving on our trick-or-treating as soon as possible. That year, Halloween fell on a Saturday, which thrilled us. We could hit every single house we wanted without having to worry about waking up early for school the next day. After classes ended, our parents drove us over to my friend Tyler's place. He lived on this road called Maple Drive. Off to the left was another identical street called Oak Street. Maple and Oak were connected at one end, while the other side led out to a busier road. Tyler's house was closer to the main road, so we decided to start at his place, then work our way down the street, hit the corner, and move up Oak Street. After that, we'd make our way back down Maple and return to Tyler's place to check out our candy haul. So there we were, a group of about 10 kids in total, but the ones I remember most were myself, Tyler, Ethan, and Jake. We were going house to house, racking up a decent pile of sweets, when we came across this one house. It wasn't too different from the others. 2 stories, a garage, a neat front yard. But there was this creepy figure that caught our attention. It looked like a cheap Michael Myers statue, standing on the front lawn. We figured it was just a decoration, so we went up to the door, got our candy, and then checked it out. The statue was hunched over, holding a fake knife. Jake, being Jake, thought it would be funny to kick it in the leg. Suddenly, the statue jerked back and started clutching its leg, like it was actually hurt. That's when we realized, horrified, that this statue was actually a person all along. "I'm going to gut you kids!" the man shouted, his voice low and menacing. Now, people throw around threats like that all the time, right? Usually it's just empty words. So, we thought he was just trying to scare us and didn't pay it much mind. We kept moving, laughing it off. It wasn't until around 8 p.m., when the night had gotten a lot darker, that things changed. I used to live out west back then, and if you know those parts, you'd know how quickly the darkness creeps in once the sun dips below the horizon. Anyway, we were still going door to door, joking about horror movies like Scream and Halloween, discussing how they'd play out if we were in them. It was around then that one of our group, Ethan, dropped his candy bag. We stopped and waited for him to pick it up. When he bent down to get his bag, he froze, staring straight ahead. "What are you looking at?" Jake asked. Ethan didn't respond, just kept squinting like he was straining to see something far off. So we all turned to see what had him spooked. There, at the end of the street, was the same guy in the Michael Myers outfit. He was standing alone, just staring at us. No one else was around. It felt like we were the last group still out trick-or-treating. He was holding that prop knife again, and when he saw us notice him, he started walking towards us, picking up speed with every step. In a moment of pure panic, we all bolted. We were just kids, but fear makes you run faster than you'd ever think possible. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and each time, he was closer, like a shadow that just kept stretching towards us. Thankfully, the guy wasn't as fast as he looked. He lagged behind us by a good distance, but it didn't make us feel any safer. Our saving grace came when a silver minivan pulled up at the intersection of Oak Street. It was Jake's mom, out looking for us. We didn't even think twice. We piled into that van so fast it was like a scene out of those dumb cartoons we used to watch. We were all shouting at once, trying to explain what had happened, but Jake's mom didn't need convincing. She saw the man too. She slammed on the gas and sped off. As we drove away, I looked out the back window, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The man was still there, running down the street, his knife raised in the air. I could see the white mask under the streetlights, the expressionless face staring after us. It was like something out of a nightmare. When we finally got back to Tyler's house, we were all shaken up, but a little relieved too. We thought that was the end of it. But Alec and Ethan swore up and down that they saw him still pacing up and down the neighborhood, looking for us, even after we'd left. That image has stayed with me ever since. Whether that knife was real or not doesn't even matter to me. I'll never forget that night. It's been almost 10 years since, and I haven't gone out on Halloween since then. I don't care if I'm paranoid. Better safe than sorry, right? Stay safe out there, and happy Halloween, everyone. I was around 12 when this weird event happened, just a couple of days before Halloween in 2017. Bored out of my mind, I decided to take a stroll outside around 10 p.m. Wandering in the woods alone had always been my thing. It was peaceful, and no one ever bothered me. I liked the way the trees looked so different in the darkness and the eerie silence by the small lake nearby. I just walked past my neighbor's big yellow house, where they were throwing a loud costume party. Bright lights were flashing through the windows, and I could hear people laughing and shouting drunkenly in the front yard. I finally made it to the quiet woods, just like I'd planned. As soon as I stepped onto the path, an uneasy feeling crept up my spine. I couldn't really make out where I was stepping, and ended up pulling out my earbuds just to keep track of any weird noises. The tension faded a bit once I reached the other side of the woods, and found myself on the deserted road that looped back toward my street. I breathed easier as I slipped my earbuds back in and continued walking, convinced I'd just psyched myself out for no reason. But as I rounded the corner, I spotted something, or rather, someone, by the corner of the still busy yellow house. It was a skinny figure, standing awkwardly under one of the dim streetlights, and I instantly froze up. Gripping my house key between my fingers like a weapon, I strained my eyes to make out what I was looking at. The figure was a tall man, his skin almost unnaturally pale, dressed in some sort of dark jacket. For a split second, I seriously thought I was staring at some kind of ghost. As he moved closer, my heart started pounding. His face came into view. It was painted to look like a grinning skull. He was stumbling and weaving across the empty street, clearly drunk out of his mind. I remember thinking for a moment that he might be so wasted that he wouldn't even notice me. But as he zigzagged closer, I realized he was heading straight for me. I was terrified, completely frozen in place. My house was barely 3 houses away, but getting past him seemed impossible. I didn't know if I could even run, with my asthma and all. My mind was racing, scrambling for any possible escape route. Could I backtrack and try another route? Maybe sneak around the neighborhood and loop back to my house? No way. I was already feeling on edge, and the idea of walking in pitch darkness didn't sit right with me. My grandma's place? Also out of the question. Even if she was home, it was too far, and I'd still have to pass by this creep. As I stood there, debating what to do, he suddenly grabbed my shoulder, gripping it tight. My music was still blasting in my ears, so his words sounded garbled. I managed to catch bits and pieces, something about why a kid like me would be out so late. I couldn't respond, just stood there, rooted to the spot. He stopped talking for a second, his gaze shifting past me as he lifted a shaky finger and pointed at the shadowy woods behind the houses. My heart almost stopped. There was no way I'd let him drag me back there. In that instant, panic took over. Without even thinking, I yanked away from his grip and bolted down the street, cutting through the corner of the party's lawn to get a bit more distance. I could hear the shouts and music fading behind me as I ran like I'd never run before, eyes locked on the front door of my house. As I reached it, my hands were trembling so badly that I struggled to jam my key into the rusted lock. All I could think of was the image of him grabbing me again, pulling me back into that darkness. After what felt like forever, the door clicked open, and I practically threw myself inside. I kicked off my shoes and scrambled down to the basement, choking on sobs as I told my older brother everything. He listened quietly, his face pale, then grabbed his phone and called our parents. They weren't home but promised they'd drive by and look around. We didn't call the cops. I guess we didn't think it'd help much, seeing as nothing serious had happened. The next day, my dad told me that the man was just some local cab driver who'd had a bit too much to drink. Nobody seemed to care. We never mentioned it again. It's been about 7 years now, and I still get jumpy walking alone at night, even though I've long since moved to a bigger city. I've shared this story with a few friends, and they're always shocked that no one took it seriously. Honestly, it still makes me angry that I never even got an apology. I'm so relieved I don't live in that small town anymore, where everyone just shrugs stuff like this off. At least in the city, people keep an eye out for each other, and there are enough streetlights to not feel like I'm going to be swallowed by the darkness every time I step outside after sundown. This happened just a few Halloweens ago. I'm a single guy, living alone in a small complex in Dallas. The place has rows of townhouse-style buildings, each only 2 floors high. I live on the ground floor of one of them. The apartments are relatively new, and all the doors have electronic locks. You can unlock your door through an app if you forget your keys. I've always found that unnecessary, but it's a nice backup. My neighbors are mostly young families, so I get some trick-or-treaters each year, but not too many. Maybe 6 or 7 in total. It's not like our community is gated or anything, but I think the layout makes it look private, so kids from nearby areas don't come here. I always have a small stash of candy ready for the neighborhood kids anyway. This Halloween started off like any other. I stayed home to hand out candy, as usual. Kids began knocking at around 6:30 p.m. Most of them were familiar faces from the area. By 7 p.m., I'd already given out candy to nearly all the regulars, so I assumed that was it for the night. I went back to my couch, turned on some random TV show, and ate a couple of the leftover Snickers bars. I always get candy I like because there's almost always some left at the end of the night. By 8 p.m., I was sure it was over, so I got up and switched off the porch light, signaling I was done for the evening. Just as I turned around to head back to the couch, I heard a soft knock at the door. Through the small window in the door, I saw a man standing outside. It wasn't unusual for parents to bring younger kids to the door, so I thought there must be a child hiding behind him. But since the window was at eye level, I couldn't see below his waist to check. "Just a second," I called out, heading back to grab the candy bowl from the living room. When I returned and opened the door, I was caught off guard. The man was alone. He stood there, wearing a faded gray hoodie and black sweatpants. He was about my height, maybe a little taller, and just stared at me with a blank expression. His face was clean-shaven, and he looked to be around his late 30s, maybe early 40s. "Hey man, sorry to bother you this late. My car's giving me some trouble. Do you mind if I use your phone?" he asked, a slight grin on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. I hesitated, feeling an immediate discomfort. These days, people keep everything on their phones, banking info, private messages. It's like your whole life is on there. Handing it over to a stranger didn't seem like a smart move. I don't think so, man. But I can call someone for you if you want," I offered cautiously. "Seriously, dude. Just for a minute. I just need to make one quick call," he insisted, his tone shifting slightly, losing that forced politeness. We went back and forth like that for a minute or two. He kept pushing, and I kept turning him down. I could see him getting more and more irritated, his expression tightening with each refusal. "Sorry, it's not gonna happen," I finally said, more firmly this time. "I think you should just go." His face flushed with anger, and for a split second I thought he might actually try something. But he didn't. Instead, he just glared at me, muttered something under his breath, and turned on his heel. I quickly shut the door and locked it, feeling my heart pound faster than it should have. I peeked through the window, watching as he stalked off, his shoulders tense. The whole thing left me feeling uneasy, like I'd narrowly avoided something bad. Once he was far enough away, I decided to slip outside quietly and see where he was going. Staying a good distance behind, I trailed him down the street. I kept about 40 feet between us, making sure not to get too close. He didn't seem to notice me as he headed toward a small strip mall just a few blocks from my place. I ducked behind a parked car and watched as he walked into the empty lot and approached an old sedan. He got in and drove off without a second glance. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to piece together what had just happened. It felt strange, like he'd singled me out on purpose. That's when it hit me. The app-controlled locks. Maybe he had some way of messing with that if he'd gotten access to my phone. It seemed like a pretty crazy plan just to rob one guy's apartment, but maybe he knew I lived alone. Maybe he'd been watching. Whatever his intention was, it definitely wasn't good. He'd lied straight to my face and tried to worm his way in. This happened to my brother, and it's told from his viewpoint. Back in October 2019, I went trick-or-treating with a few of my buddies, who I'll call Trevor, Jason, and Luke. We were all around 13 or 14 years old, and we figured it'd be one of our last chances to go out like this. High school was coming up fast, with all the homework and studying, and we probably wouldn't get to enjoy another Halloween night running through the neighborhood again. So, there we were, wandering down this one quiet street around 9:30 p.m., when we stumbled across a house that had gone all out with Halloween decorations. It was like something out of a horror movie. Fog machines, glowing skeletons, and even a fake graveyard. The whole setup must have cost hundreds of dollars. Curious, we went up to the front porch and rang the doorbell. A man, probably in his mid-50s, opened the door. He glanced at us and said, "No need to be loud. Just come in and you'll get your treats." Trevor, being cautious, replied, "Can't you just bring the candy out here?" The guy didn't respond, just stood there with this blank look. That was weird enough for us to decide it wasn't worth the trouble, so we turned around and walked off. But of course, if that was all there was, this wouldn't be much of a story, right? We'd made it about halfway down my street when Jason suddenly said, "Guys, I'm pretty sure that dude's following us." We turned, and sure enough, there he was, about 30 feet behind us, moving slowly like he had all the time in the world. Without saying a word, we bolted down the block, my heart hammering in my chest. The guy wasn't even running, he was just strolling after us. We made it to my house, flung the door open, and locked it tight. We all stood there, gasping for air, our bodies shaking like we'd just sprinted 100 miles. I was trying to catch my breath when Luke suddenly whispered, "Dude, look at the window." We all turned, and my stomach dropped. The man was right there, staring through one of my windows. My parents were out of town for the weekend, and my older brother was crashing at a buddy's house for some party. We had no one to call for help. But the worst part? I noticed he had a small handgun clutched in his grip. We panicked and bolted upstairs, huddling in my bedroom. Jason fumbled for his phone and dialed 911. It felt like an eternity, but the cops showed up about 15 minutes later. By then, the guy had vanished from my yard, but we knew exactly which house he came from. The officers checked it out, and after what seemed like forever, they brought him out in cuffs. Turns out, the house was abandoned. The guy wasn't just some creep. He was a full-blown psychopath who'd broken out of a mental institution 2 weeks earlier. What freaked us out the most was thinking about what could have happened if we'd actually gone inside that house when he asked us to. We all swore that night to never go near that street again, even when we're much older. I mean, who knows what might have gone down if we hadn't run when we did. I shudder to think about it. I'm just thankful we were old enough to sense something was off and didn't brush it off as some Halloween prank. So, if you're ever out trick-or-treating and get a weird vibe from a house, just leave. Doesn't matter how much candy they're offering. No amount of chocolate is worth putting yourself in danger. Trust your gut and get the hell out of there if something doesn't feel right. It's that time of the year again when we start swapping ghost stories. But I hardly ever share this one, because it's not your usual scary story. It's more unsettling than anything. I used to work nights at this old, sprawling warehouse. There weren't many of us on the night shift, just a handful of security and admin folks, maybe 10 people in total. As admin, I usually hung out with security when they were switching between patrolling or monitoring the cameras. It was normally dead quiet, with nothing much going on. The place didn't have any real history of tragedies or strange occurrences, at least none that I knew of. No one had ever died there, no terrible accidents, And it wasn't built on top of an old graveyard or anything like that. Just another big, boring building. But you know how rumors start and get out of hand, especially in places like this. Big, empty, shadowy structures that feel like they're always watching you. The place was surrounded by thick woods, with a tall fence running all around. At night, it felt utterly abandoned, the darkness almost swallowing the whole area. The motion-activated lights inside and outside only made it creepier, flickering on and off, casting weird shadows that seemed to stretch forever. Sounds echoed oddly in there, giving everything this weirdly intense silence. But none of us had ever actually experienced anything strange. Not until that night. It was around mid-October, just a couple of weeks before Halloween. I was halfway through my shift, taking my break. It was chilly out, so I decided to head to my car for a heavier jacket and a quick smoke. I stepped outside through the back entrance, where the fence was closest, maybe 10 feet away from the door. The only light was one of those annoying motion sensors, so I had to keep waving my arm like an idiot to keep it on. Beyond that, it was just a sea of darkness, all grass and shadows up to the fence. I leaned against the wall, scrolling through my phone, when the light went out again. I stayed put in the dark, sipping my coffee and puffing on my cigarette. After finishing, I reached up and waved to turn the light back on. And that's when I heard it. A rustling sound, right by the fence. My first thought was that it was probably some raccoon or stray dog. But as I stood up, I realized the fence was still softly rattling. The light didn't cover much ground outside the circle it created, so I couldn't see well. I squinted into the darkness, but there was nothing. For some reason, maybe just out of habit or stupidity, I called out, "Hello?" The noise stopped instantly. I kept staring into the dark, trying to make out what I was seeing. The light flickered off again, and I stood there squinting, hoping for the moonlight to help. The fence rattled softly. I blinked a few times, and then I saw it, a slight motion at the far side of the fence. It looked like someone was tugging on the metal links, almost like they were trying to get in. My first thought was, it had to be some kid trying to mess around. Maybe they were planning to sneak in for a thrill or just dare each other to hang out near the haunted place. A few years back, some high schoolers showed up, not knowing the building was still active. But we usually just let them off with a warning as long as they didn't cause trouble. But there was just one person now, standing completely still, except for the light shaking of the fence. It didn't feel right at all. I radioed into the main security office. "Hey, there's someone by the back fence, north side. You see anything on the cameras?" I knew this part was covered well. They'd see whatever I was seeing, no problem. After a few seconds of static, a voice replied, "No movement detected out there. You sure it's not just a shadow or something from the woods?" "No way, man. It's right in front of me. Someone's playing with the fence." I barely finished my sentence when the jingling turned into a full-on clatter. The figure went from a soft shake to a sudden frenzied sprint straight at me. I let out this ridiculous choking sound, dropping my cigarette as I scrambled to yank open the door. I stumbled backward, practically slamming myself into the wall as I grabbed for the knob. I twisted it, trying to get inside fast, but something on the other side was pushing back, like it was keeping the door shut. My pulse pounded in my ears as I forced the door open and shoved myself in, slamming it shut behind me. The door jerked violently in my grip. I could hear someone, or something, pushing on it from outside. I yelled into the radio, "Get over here now!" My voice cracked. Before I could get any response, I heard heavy footsteps coming from inside the building. The door handle stopped moving just as the rest of the security team reached me. They looked at me, then at the door, all wide-eyed. But when we finally got back to the office, they seemed to relax, saying stuff like, "Nice try, you really tried to get us with that one, huh?" I was still shaking, and I couldn't believe they weren't taking it seriously. Until we pulled up the security feed. The screen showed me outside, alone. No one at the fence, no one running at me, just me standing there, freaking out at empty air. My mind went blank. It was like I'd imagined the whole thing. I started doubting myself immediately, wondering if maybe I'd lost it for a second, or if they'd tampered with the footage somehow. But as we reviewed it again, we noticed something weird. The door handle was moving on its own, twisting slowly even after I let go. visible from both the inside and outside camera angles. Right before I turned to bolt inside, I remembered seeing the fence give a little shudder, like someone had shoved it. But there were no gaps, no cuts, no way for anyone to squeeze through. No eerie shadows, no drifting fog or strange lights. Just me, standing there alone in the dark, practically jumping out of my skin and running back like a scared animal. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to remember if the light had switched on because of my movement or theirs. I just couldn't tell. Everything happened too fast. The others didn't buy it. They brushed it off like it was nothing, just shadows playing tricks or too much caffeine making me jittery. The branches probably rubbed against the fence, they said. No one had ever seen anything weird out there before, and why would it suddenly start now? So, I dropped it. I didn't want to argue or be the guy everyone thought was losing it. I tried to get on with my shift, but from that night on, no one used that back door again. It stayed locked tight. One of the older security guards, who'd been there longer than anyone, finished his shift with me in the office. It was just before dawn, and we watched the day shift slowly filling up the parking lot. He sat there, eyes glued to the monitors while I wrapped up some paperwork. Then, out of nowhere, he cleared his throat and mumbled, "Never really cared for that north side. Feels like something's always watching you over there." I nearly dropped my pen. He hardly spoke a word to anyone, let alone about stuff like this. The fact that he, of all people, said something made it hit harder. But I didn't quit. I stuck around for another 6 or 7 months until the company got bought out, and they ended the night shift. They dumped all the work onto the day crew, and most of us left. To my knowledge, nothing else ever happened. At least, I didn't hear about it. I made sure to never step foot near that area again. I even quit smoking, just so I'd have an excuse not to take breaks outside. Instead, I'd kill time chatting with coworkers or scrolling through my phone in the lobby. I wasn't the only one either. A few of us found reasons to stay inside during breaks. I've never experienced anything like that again. My imagination's never run wild before or since. I keep thinking back to the way that door handle jerked up and down, even when I'd stepped away, radio in hand. That had to be real, right? There's no way I imagined it. No one mentioned it afterward. It became one of those things we pretended didn't happen. Whenever people asked about working in that old, falling-apart warehouse, everyone would laugh and say, "We never saw anything strange out there." Just a dead, quiet building at night. I'd smile and keep my mouth shut, keeping my experience tucked away. But I've always wondered if any of the others have their own stories buried somewhere, locked up tight like mine. Maybe after a few drinks they'd let one slip, and that'd be enough to keep the questions going about the place. The so-called haunted factory. I think this happened around 2006, back when we were living in a small town in Indiana. I must have been about 12 then, and my little sister Sarah was probably around 7 or 8. We had been going out trick-or-treating for a few years by then, mostly just around our street. But last year, we decided to venture out a bit further on our own. Halloween was always one of my favorite times of the year. There was just something thrilling about going door to door without any adults around, pretending to be grown up while still getting loads of candy. That year, Sarah was obsessed with The Incredibles and wanted to go as Violet. Since we were so close, I decided to play along and dressed up as Dash to match. It felt nice doing something that made us look like a team, and I knew it made her happy. I'm not big on costumes, mostly because I can't stand wearing lots of layers or anything too tight, but I figured I'd do it for her. I didn't have to do much anyway, just wore a red jumpsuit and called it a day. The only thing that really worried me that year was all the stuff I'd been hearing on the news. There were reports about kids our age going missing. I couldn't remember all the details, but I knew some of the disappearances were happening pretty close to us. It was unsettling because I realized how often I was by myself. My parents would leave me at home alone, sometimes with Sarah, while they ran errands or went grocery shopping. I'd walk to school alone too, since the bus stop was out of view from our house. I even rode my bike around the neighborhood, or to the corner store by myself. Hearing about those kids made me feel uneasy, but my parents never seemed too worried. When the news would talk about the missing kids, Mom would say things like, "What kind of parents let their kids roam around like that?" Yet, she still let us wander around alone. When I asked if we should still go out by ourselves that Halloween, she just shrugged it off and said, "Of course. What could happen?" So, we got ready, and I made sure to grab my dad's old metal flashlight and hide it in my candy bag, just in case. I thought the flashlight would be useful, not just for lighting our way, but also as a makeshift weapon if we needed it. I kept reminding myself to stay alert, though a small part of me felt ridiculous. It was Halloween, and people were just out having fun. But still, I couldn't shake off the unease that crept up my spine every now and then. Maybe it was just the idea of knocking on strangers' doors without any adults around. Regardless, I was determined to make sure we had a good time, no matter how tense I felt. We decided to head up the street first, where only a few houses dotted the hill before the road curved around. After the bend, there was an empty place, probably still for sale, since I remembered seeing a for sale sign outside just a few weeks back. The road then dipped into a small cul-de-sac with 4 more houses. We hit them all, and by the time we left the last one, our bags were already heavy with candy. My sister's excitement started rubbing off on me, and I could feel myself relax a little, the earlier tension easing. From there, we continued down the road until we spotted a house that really stood out. They'd transformed their yard into a full-blown horror show. Fake tombstones scattered all over, with skeletons and fog machines that made the whole place look like a scene from a zombie movie. A guy dressed as the Grim Reaper was standing by a tree, completely still. I almost didn't notice him until we got closer and he jumped, making us both yelp. To my surprise, Sarah giggled instead of running off, telling me she wasn't scared. At the front door, an elderly couple greeted us, commenting on how great our costumes looked. They seemed nice, chatting us up for a few minutes before dropping huge handfuls of candy into our bags. I couldn't help but notice how they kept glancing behind us, as if expecting more trick-or-treaters. When they finally said goodbye, we made our way out through a side gate, back onto the sidewalk. As we walked on, Sarah started rummaging through her candy bag, spotting a little plastic toy the couple had slipped in. She wanted to take it out and play with it right away, but I urged her to wait until we were somewhere with more light. I didn't want her to trip or run into someone while distracted. And sure enough, just as I was trying to get her to put the toy back, we nearly collided with someone right in front of us. I looked up and saw a tall guy dressed in a dark, hooded jacket. He seemed to appear out of nowhere. I swear there was nobody on the sidewalk just seconds earlier. The group of kids that had been ahead of us was already gone, and I hadn't seen anyone walking behind us since we left the last house. There was something off about the way he just seemed to be standing there, almost as if he was waiting for us. Maybe he'd been behind us earlier and just slipped by while we were at the last house, but I honestly didn't remember seeing anyone like him before. I stepped back, my heart doing a weird skip, and muttered a quick apology. The guy just smiled, too wide, and said, "Oh, no worries, sweetheart. Are you all right?" I froze. No one calls me that. Not even my own family. It felt off, like he was crossing some invisible line just by saying it. I grabbed Sarah's hand, my pulse racing. "Yeah, I'm fine," I mumbled, trying not to show how freaked out I was. We squeezed past him, but I could feel his eyes on us the whole time. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was still standing in the same spot, turned completely towards us now. I nudged Sarah to keep moving faster, urging her to hurry up to the next house. But after we finished getting our candy there, I looked around and saw him again, just standing by the sidewalk, grinning at us. "Got quite a haul there, huh?" he called out, his voice syrupy sweet. "Need a hand carrying those bags?" I wanted to tell him off, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I blurted out, "No," in the most grown-up voice I could muster, and tugged Sarah along with me. My hands were shaking. What was this guy's deal? He didn't seem interested in candy, and I doubted he was out trick-or-treating. If it wasn't about the sweets, then what did he want? My thoughts spiraled, going straight to the stories on the news about those missing kids. Was he the one behind it? Was he waiting for the right moment to grab us too? Panic bubbled up as I looked around, desperately searching for someone, anyone, who could help. The group of kids from earlier had disappeared, and there were no other adults around. My mind raced through options. Then I remembered Miss Laura's place. She was this sweet lady who lived just a few houses down and was always at the front desk whenever we visited my mom's office. She'd known me and Sarah for years, always had candy or little toys for us whenever we dropped by. And more importantly, her house was on this very street, just around the corner. "We should go to Miss Laura's first," I whispered to Sarah, trying to sound calm. She didn't argue, probably sensing how tense I was or just getting tired of walking. We passed the first house on the block, and that's when I heard it again. His voice. "Hey, don't skip any. You missed one, didn't you?" Before I could say anything, Sarah turned around and shouted, "You're being weird!" His grin faltered, just for a split second, but that was enough for me. I squeezed her hand tight, and we took off running. I didn't even care if he got mad at us for yelling back. I just wanted to put as much distance between us as possible. We raced down the street, my ears straining to catch any sound of footsteps behind us. We sprinted all the way to Miss Laura's place, and as soon as we got there, I shoved Sarah in front of me and snatched her bag out of her hands. She started knocking on the door like crazy while I kept glancing back, my heart hammering in my chest. When Miss Laura finally opened up, holding a big bowl of candy, I almost collapsed from relief. Without even thinking, I begged her to let us inside. She didn't hesitate, quickly ushering us in and locking the door behind us. "What's going on, sweetie?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I struggled to catch my breath and blurted out everything in a messy jumble. How this guy had been following us, the creepy stuff he said, and how he just wouldn't leave us alone. Miss Laura listened, nodding, then told me we'd done the right thing by coming straight to her. After giving us some water to calm down, she went to call my mom while we sat on the couch, trying to distract ourselves with the TV. Just as I started to think everything was fine, we heard a knock on the door. I froze, my stomach dropping. It was Halloween, so I tried convincing myself it was just more trick-or-treaters. But when Miss Laura answered, it wasn't a bunch of kids. It was him. He stood there looking calm and started talking to her like they were old friends. He claimed we were his kids, and he'd lost track of us when we ran off. My blood ran cold as he tried to peer past her, his eyes locking on us. Miss Laura didn't miss a beat. "I know these kids, and they're not yours," she said firmly, her voice hardening. "I think it's best if you leave right now. The police are on their way." His expression shifted, like he was caught off guard, but then he forced a smile, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Oh, I must have gotten mixed up. My mistake," he said, backing away slowly. He gave us one last look over Miss Laura's shoulder before muttering, "Good night," and disappeared into the shadows. She closed the door and stayed by the window, keeping watch. It didn't take long for my parents and the cops to arrive. I ran straight into my mom's arms, finally feeling safe for the first time that night. We sat down and went over everything, describing the guy as best we could. I remember how shaky my voice was, replaying the events over and over in my head. Before we left, I gave Miss Laura the biggest hug ever. I don't know what would have happened if she hadn't been home. There's no way I would have had the guts to ask a stranger to let us in, no matter how scared I was. We went home that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The police never found him, and I still wonder what his real plan was. After that night, my parents started following us in the car whenever we went trick-or-treating. I guess it was their way of making sure we'd never be alone again. Even now, years later, I can't help but wonder if he was the same guy from the news.